Ladies and gents, welcome to episode 1 of Common Ground Conversations, where we ask the important but controversial questions with the goal of finding common ground. Today we're at Flinders Street Station, Melbourne, Australia, and we're going to be asking, should trans athletes have their own competitive category or not? With that, let's get to it.
Yeah, playing with these heartstrings, I don't wanna ring. Same time, I ain't looking for a fling. Same time, I be liking what you bringing to the table. I know you able, capable of more. Current man, he a little too unstable. For a little mamacita like you, yeah. For a little love diva like you, yeah. Now for an all-time favorite crowd pleaser like you, and that's the truth. I ain't gonna let you loose. You could come back to my place.
So maybe just to set the stage. Our goal is, it's not me versus you versus me. It's not me just agreeing with you or you just agreeing with me. The goal is really, how can we understand all of the factors that go into the question and then try and establish as much common ground as possible. So based on where you currently sit, do you think that trans women or trans athletes more generally should have their own competitive category, or do you think that they...
No, I think they should. It's fairer for them as well.
And what makes you say that? Or what makes you go to...
Well, because it depends on what your physical body is. If you are a man competing against somebody who's been born a woman, it doesn't matter what is actually happening in your brain, it's what your body is going to do in the competition that will make it fair or unfair, is how I see it. I know there's a lot of variations, but I think that is, we need to do that to be fair to the trans people as well, because they need to compete in a level playing field where they're competing in a way that's fair to them.
Absolutely.
So if they're winning all of the time, or say losing, but let's say winning, if you're a man in competing, you were a man, but now you're a
transition to
female.
Yep.
Your body's still, you've been born in a man's body, and so when you're competing with women, it doesn't matter how smart we are, we don't have the physical strength of men. So I think for that reason, for it to be fair, you need to compete with other people who are like born similar to you.
So far, everything that you've said, I think I agree with. I think that there's a difference in performance between biological males and biological females, and a large proportion of that can be laid at the feet of underlying biological differences. Where there seems to be some disagreement is, in an instance like that, can we make it an even playing field, say for example with trans women, so biological males who've transitioned to being a woman? Can we do something to make it such that they can fairly and safely compete against biological females? So, for example, having some kind of hormonal treatment to reduce their testosterone. Do you see that as ever potentially being enough to equalise the playing field?
No, I don't think so. I don't think it can, because you've still got muscle strength. You've still got the physical attributes of a male.
So let me play devil's advocate a little bit more. Let's say that we had some research, which we don't at the moment, but let's say we had some strong research that X intervention, some kind of intervention, resulted in a 20% power and strength decrease in a biological male who then transitioned to being a woman. And let's say that the average performance difference was about 20% in a particular sport. Would you still then say that it's unfair, or would it be fair, but you just don't think that it would necessarily be the best solution?
No, I don't think it's the best solution. I really don't see it that way. We do have people who are, say the Williams sisters when they play tennis. They're bigger than the average woman.
Yep.
But they still are female. They've still got the same issues other girls have got, but they are stronger because they're bigger.
Yep.
But I don't think that trying to fit somebody into the category, trying to force them into that category, the Williams sisters are naturally as they are. They're stronger and bigger.
Yep. Yep.
But I honestly, I don't see how it can really work. There may be situations where it can work, but on average, I can't see that it would really work.
Right.
I think I can't see why they can't have a separate area, a separate,
category. Yeah.
Because
So
it just seems fairer to me that they're competing more with people in the same physical attributes.
yeah. I think some people who are might say that they are pro-trans inclusion, which I think most of us are pro-trans inclusion. It's just that we think that there's a different solution to it. But I think that some people will say, if we don't include, say, trans women within the women's category, or trans men within the men's category, that it's somehow denying their identity or denying their legitimacy as a man or a woman. What would you say to someone who maybe has those concerns?
Well, see, look, I don't mind what anybody is. I honestly don't. I judge everyone on what kind of person they are.
I love that.
I honestly don't care. Decent people, or people who are doing the right thing, good people, who are kind to others and get along well with other people, and you can live any way you like.
Yeah.
I think that's how it should
Very,
be.
very libertarian.
As long as that you're not, whatever you do is not impacting in a bad way on other people, your business surely is your own business.
Yep.
But I do think I'm quite. It is unfortunate some people aren't just fitting straight into a certain mould when they're born, and they never quite feel comfortable like that. But if you look at people in other categories of life, there's lots of issues like that where people live. They go to live in an area or with people, or they grow up in an environment where they really don't belong and they never feel a sense of belonging. But somehow they work to overcome that, and they fit into the community by things they do themselves. They make themselves fit in. They go out of their way to fit in. And somehow when you are changed, I honestly can't say I'm really speaking from the view of someone who understands it exactly, because I'm not in that position, although I have known people who are.
Yeah.
And I know it can be painful, but you have to understand there's some things you're just not going to be able to make fit that whole picture the way you want it to.
Yeah.
You may be able to change, you can dress up, you can fit in, you can work in female or male environments, either way, whatever it suits you to do. But in some things you just aren't going to be able to make it the 100%. And I think sport is one of those.
And to me, that sounds like you're very inclusive in the sense that you're not discriminating against trans people for being trans.
But why would anyone?
Right, exactly. And I think most people have that position, that just because someone is trans doesn't mean that they're somehow any less worthy or any less valuable as an individual. But I think some people interpret not allowing them to compete in one of those categories as some kind of assault on their worth or identity, which I think is part of where the miscommunication happens, perhaps. Because I also agree. I think that there's reasons why, very good reasons, why a potential solution would be having a separate trans category, one for trans women and one for trans men, and that even within those categories, being able to try and establish what would be fair, like let's say that there had to be a certain treatment protocol followed by trans women and a certain treatment protocol followed by trans men, to make sure that even within those categories, there's a degree of fairness. One other point I thought I'd share with you is, especially in the media, we hear a lot about trans women competing within the women's category and doing very well for themselves and winning certain competitions, whether it be Laurel Hubbard, Leah Thomas, a couple of the names going around. But I would also be concerned about, like, if our expectation is that biological males who transition to being a woman have to compete in the women's category, what about the biological females who transition to being men? Do we expect them to compete in the men's category? Because if we did, they would be at a biological disadvantage. So in one way, being pro-trans women inclusion in the women's category kind of implies that you're going to be excluding trans men to some degree from fair competition in the men's category. Did that make sense?
Yeah, well, I just think so be it. You know, like the women need to compete in the women's, and if there's maybe you could have an area where people who are either way can join together and do it, have a sport set up for them, or a separate group again. But how many groups are you going to have?
Yeah, well, I guess you can start separating down all the different dimensions, and where do you stop?
It's like now we're saying there's 52 varieties of women, supposedly. I mean, I think a woman's a woman and a man is a man, regardless. But
You've got to come sit down next week as well. we get the next question. The next question is going to be, what is a man? What is a woman? Because I think that.
Why are we trying to change what that is? Why can't we all just we talk now about people being accepted of everybody, and yet we're going out of our way to make all groups divided. So that can't possibly lean towards a cohesive society, because now we're saying black people need a category, white people need a category, Aboriginal people need a category, Lebanese people, and we keep it on.
And then you need the black women, the black men.
That's right.
The black trans, the white women, the white. Yeah.
So if you look back into early history and you look at things like the Second World War is probably the biggest, most recent one everybody is aware of, and you think about what happened there, the reason it became what it did was the leader of the aggressor, say, divided everybody up into separate groups, so then they all turned on each other because your group was valued above mine. My family's safer if I'm in this group, and your family's not safer, even though we've been neighbours and we've lived next door. We will put you in if we get anything on you, because that keeps our family safe. So the divisions are what breaks up society. So it's different when we're speaking about sport, because that we're talking about people's strength. It can be all kinds of strength, mental strength, physical strength, all kinds of things make up sport. Some tiny people make amazing efforts, and they do very, very well in sports where bigger people have always excelled. So weightlifting can be anything. Football, for instance.
Basketball, even there are some short, amazing basketball players.
That's right. And so that's a different thing. But when we start breaking up people into categories, which is what you're going to be speaking about next, that is where people start getting divided. We have to have a society. All life matters. All life counts. Treat everybody equally, and the world will be a far, far better place. And on that note,
Rosemary, that was a beautiful ending. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
You have a lovely day.
Good luck with your research.
Thank you. Take care. We'll get a little timer going, because I'll make sure that you're on time. All right, bro. My name's Rich again.
Nice to meet you.
So, should trans athletes have their own competitive category or not? What do you think?
I think they should, purely based on physical components. I think that men all over the world have more of a biological advantage compared to women. Even though that women are just as great as men in the world. I personally have a trans family friend, and he's the nicest person in the world, but he's 5'4", I'm 6'6", just saying that. And I could easily, without even having any skill sets, just tackle the crap out of someone in sports. Someone like Buddy Franklin against whatever women's AFL player. They both played in the same league. I can guarantee you that Buddy Franklin could easily deck the crap out of
and it would be a I think many people would view it as a safety hazard, right? If you want to prioritize female safety, which I think large majority of people would be like, yes, I'm very much for female safety. And you can also be pro trans inclusion. But you have to balance the two. So you saying, for example, that you think that say for example, a biological male ought not be able to compete against a biological female.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that you're trans exclusionary.
Yeah.
You can be very much pro-trans inclusion, but also be consciously weighing that up with how do we make sure that it's safe and fair for biological females.
Yeah.
Is there ever like an instance, whether it's like a sport or whether there's like a particular hormone therapy that would, in your eyes, make it fair in some way?
To be honest, I just think the only way to make it fair is if it's a skill set. But even so,
It's like chess.
Yeah, it's exactly like chess. I think purely based on skill set is the only way a woman could physically dominate a man. If they don't have an advantage, let's say, for example, grappling or wrestling.
Yep. Power, strength.
Yeah, power, strength, or even just momentum.
Yep.
But in saying that, like, I'm still centre left. Like, I still believe in equal rights or whatever. But when it comes to sports, as you were saying, safety hazards as well.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned UFC before, right? So
Yeah.
like, are you familiar with Fallon Fox? Did you?
No.
So it was a biological male
Yeah.
who transitioned to being a woman.
Yeah.
And didn't declare it with the UFC.
Yeah.
Had a couple of fights, broke the skull of a particular woman who she fought against.
Yeah.
And then it kind of came out that she was originally a biological male, had gone through a male puberty, accrued all the advantages that are associated with that, bone density, muscle fiber, composition, all of that.
Yeah.
And then I think a lot of people's concerns is, well, what about all of the biological females who are now, if they want to continue competing, they have to fight a biological male.
Yeah.
And even if there was some kind of hormonal therapy, my concern would be that even after a hormonal therapy intervention, like let's say that Fallon Fox's testosterone levels were reduced to a certain amount for a certain period of time, what about all of the advantages that we garner in having gone through a male puberty? Say, for example, the development of our bones, whether it's bone density or whether it's like our skeletal frame, things
even
like this.
Males with aerobic and anaerobic advantages, and genetically different countries that we come from all over the world of ethnicities have more advantage. I'm mixed race. I'm African, East African from Sudan, and I'm also Maori, New Zealand. That's given me genetically a taller genetic compared to someone who's from Southeast Asia.
Did you say East Africa?
Yeah, so East African is Sudanese, mixed with Egyptian. You also got Ethiopian and Kenyan.
Yeah.
A lot of those people, if you even look in the Olympics, have more advantage in terms of aerobic compared to people who are from the Western world.
Yeah.
Just purely based on desert circumstances.
And it's my concern is like I'm concerned that in some people's eyes, you're not allowed to say that. And I'm like, well, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Just because, like, why are we not able to say that certain genetic pools of people have correlates in terms of their performance in sports?
It's just,
and that's like, why is that controversial?
Yeah, I know. It's honestly science, but
I love that. Honestly, it's science.
It's literally
Common
science,
sense,
and science is discovering.
Brian, I'm conscious of your time. Are you cool with still going?
No, I got to go.
Got a jet?
It's 11.
Hash, you're a legend, man. Take care, bro. What's your name?
Trent.
Trent.
Yeah.
Rich. Nice to meet you, man. So, the goal of everything that we're doing here is just to ask the important but controversial questions and find common ground. Right. So, it's not you versus me versus you. If you, whatever perspective you take, I'll probably play a little bit of devil's advocate and whatnot, and we'll tease it out. But yeah, a lot of these questions, it's like you can't have an open discussion about them, and I think that open discussion is really good. So, what's your take, man? Should they have a separate competitive category or not?
100% they should.
100? Why?
Because if you look at your men and your women's sports as one, we'll use the NBA as an example.
Yep.
your men's sport's turning over however many more millions of dollars than your women's sport.
Yep.
If you grabbed your top player from the NBA, aka LeBron James, and put him into the women's basketball league as a transgender, he would destroy it. Absolutely destroy it. And it's unfair on the women, the actual women that tried their hardest and worked their whole life to get to where they are.
Yep. So you and I agree then that there's a biologically rooted performance advantage
Yes.
for males
Yeah.
compared to females in a lot of sports, whether it be powerlifting, basketball, swimming, etc. There are some sports maybe where there isn't a competitive advantage, say something like lawn bowls, where I'd be fine with everyone competing together, right? But so for something like, let's say, powerlifting or NBA, the concern then is, how do we include trans people whilst also making sure that biological females have access to fair and safe competition, right? So do you see any, let's say we'll take basketball as an example, or maybe we'll take something like swimming where height isn't such a challenge. Do you see there being any kind of way that we could balance those two variables, right? Including trans, but also making sure that biological women also have kind of fair competition?
Yeah, well, there's a saying, Rome wasn't built in a day. So with transgender sports, it's going to have to start off small. Just like anything. For example, rugby league, women's rugby league in Australia, it was nothing 10 years ago to what it is today.
Yep.
So if people are coming out as trans, or they don't want to be men or women, they should have their own sporting category as something to look forward to. Because
But you see, they would say, or I mean, not that I can speak on behalf of all trans people or anything like that, but some people would say in response to that, they actually want to be recognised as a man and a woman, as a real man and a real woman, right?
I understand that, but it's, if you are born as a man, you are a man. If you want to change that, you want to change that. Like, you can change it, but you can't. Technically, you're still born a man. You still got testosterone levels are higher. Everything is higher as a man. You're stronger. You're faster. It's how men are built over time.
So I'd like to insert a little distinction here. So to make things simpler for us, because the term man and woman, now it's all up for debate as to what they mean, right? When traditionally they've meant the same things for years and years and years. But now it's getting more complex, because now when you say man and someone else says man, it's like, what exactly, are we talking about the same thing or is it different? So one way to make it simpler, or to try and kind of de-muddy the waters, is making the distinction between male and female. So male being sex, biology, XY chromosome usually, and female being sex, biology, XX chromosome. And then the terms man and woman, it's like a little bit of a question mark next to them, because different people mean different things. So coming back to then having their own categories, and actually, just as a side note, we'll be doing a question in the coming weeks. What is a man, what is a woman? Which this conversation is kind of perfectly tailored for. But coming back to the trans athletes in sports, if we take swimming again, let's say that there was in the highest level of swimming, there's approximately a 10 to 20% difference in the best male swimming times and the best female swimming times. It kind of differs depending on event and whatnot. Let's say that we had a treatment protocol, right, like some kind of hormone therapy that we were able to statistically prove with a lot of confidence that it would reduce someone's average performance by 20%. In a situation like that, would you think that it would be appropriate to include, say, a trans woman, so biological male who's transitioned to woman and had hormone therapy? Do you think it would be fair to include him then?
No.
Why?
Because you said there's going to be something that changes it. Can you guarantee 100% of the time that they will lose that 20%, if it is 20%? And with everyone in the 7 billion people in the world, with your swimmers, with swimming, the difference is 0.5%. As a top athlete, if you are 0.5% better than your next opponent, you're a lot better than them, especially at the highest level.
Yeah, absolutely. That might be the difference between first and like 500.
Yeah, exactly right. So I just don't think you can do that with so much risk.
Yep.
And if you're a kid playing sports, you got your underage, you got your under 9s, you got your men's opens, you got everything. If you're a trans man, or if you're a man wanting to become a woman, you then swim in the trans woman section.
Yep.
If you're a woman wanting to become a man, you then swim in the trans men.
Yeah, right. So you're this is a really good point that you're pro trans inclusion, right? You're not saying they can't compete. You're saying they should have their own competitive category. We should try and foster that. Coming back to Rome wasn't built in a day. How do you have any ideas on how we can go about making strides towards that without excluding them?
Well, it all comes down to who's going to take the first step, who wants to be the first, say, 10 people. It's all about who gets out there first and to do it. It's going to be hard because swimming, we use swimming as an example, it's not a very, there's not much revenue from it besides the Olympics or Commonwealth Games or anything like that. There's no way to generate money week to week. So in that aspect, it is hard.
Right.
But they have to. The government would have to look at ways in including them, funding it, because it is a lot of money to host events and stuff like that. But at the moment, is there enough trans men or women that want to compete? Is there enough trans athletes that are willing to compete in their own category?
Yeah,
that's the question you got.
That would be that's a good question, man. So part of this is like highlighting that there are a lot of unanswered questions that we're still trying to figure out, as opposed to it just being like a really clear yes or no.
But there's no real yes or no answer in any question.
Facts, man. Absolutely.
It all depends on how you want to look at it and how the government wants to look at it and how the audience perceives it. Like, if the audience like it, then it will go ahead with most things. It all just comes down to time as well. I think the world's moving so hectic and so fast at the moment that people think everything happens like that. When in hindsight, rugby league took 120 years to get to where it is today. Yeah. Soccer's been around for however many hundred years. You know what I mean? So things just don't pop up anymore. It's got to take time. It's got to take effort. It's got to take money and resources.
So what if there is a separate category for trans men and trans women? Something also that I think is often missed is like, if we expect trans women to compete in the women's category, where there's a lot of concern for, is it a fair playing field? We're also implying that trans men should have to compete in the men's category.
Exactly
right. But if they have to do that, then trans men are competing against biological males.
Exactly right.
Which is why we don't hear about very many trans men dominating the men's category.
Well, you don't hear about any.
Yeah, right. So in a way, if you are pro-trans inclusion in the sense that you want trans women to compete against the women in the women's category against biological females, you're actually also implicitly excluding trans men from fair competition, which is something I don't think gets spoken about.
It doesn't get spoken about enough, but if you're going to do a trans women own category, you have to do a trans men own category again. But then it all comes down to size, weight, height, everything, like boxing. You're not going to have a heavyweight go up against a lightweight.
Right, so let's say that there's a trans women's category. How do we make sure that it's a fair and even playing field within the trans women's category and within the trans men's category? Are we going to say that, do they need to have the same treatment protocol in order to compete, or are we going to say, okay, a testosterone level, certain testosterone level will make it fair, or do you just need to identify?
If you're going to do it, if they want it the way they want it in the world that we live in, I don't necessarily agree with it, but I can understand where people are coming from. It's not my right to say who you should or you shouldn't be. But if you identify as a trans woman, then you go into that trans woman category. Right. And if you identify as a trans man, you go into that category. If you want to be a trans man boxer and you weigh 65 kilos, you're going to fight another trans man boxer at 65 kilos.
So you would... Okay, so if you... In that instance, right, you're saying that, correct me if I'm wrong, that you have to identify as a trans woman or a trans man, but it's not just like open category boxing, right? Where as long as you identify, you're good and you fight anyone. No. There's still some kind of categorization. There's
still the same categorization if you're a man or a woman.
So why wouldn't we do that? Let's say there was a trans women's category. and let's say I were to undergo, or a biological male were to undergo transition, and another biological male were to also undergo transition, but I was reducing my testosterone levels to 5 nanomole per litre, and you were reducing yours to 10 nanomole per litre, my concern there would be that there'd still be an unfair advantage within that category for the person who has the higher testosterone, right? So like, would we, one potential solution maybe is saying, okay, you need to have your testosterone below X amount for X number of months, something like that, to try and even it out. And if the goal is like inclusion but also fairness, that's something that I would view as a potential solution. I'm not sure if there's a better way of going.
The only problem with doing that is that you can testosterone boost as well. You know how people get on testosterone, like enhance their testosterone levels. What's stopping a trans woman from enhancing their testosterone levels to be up at that higher?
I guess we would hopefully have some kind of
that's what
regulatory.
It all comes down to. But it all comes down to how many people is it going to engage, and it all comes down to money. Is it going to make money? If it's not going to make money, they're not going to do it.
Why not? Right? Like let's say that there isn't enough of an audience to actually want to watch trans competition and make it economically viable. Do you think that in that case it just shouldn't happen, or should taxpayer dollars be put, say, towards establishing and funding a trans men's and trans women's sporting event?
It's not really taxpayers' dollars to go into that, because most sporting franchises are privately owned, or they were to start off with. You know what I mean? So it doesn't really have to do with us per se, but if there's money to be made in it, then I believe somebody will take the opportunity to. For example, Dana White in the UFC. He's taken that over and it's blown through the roof.
But because like my concern, or one of like a concern that comes to me is that if we did have two separate categories, trans women, trans men, how many people would actually watch it? And let's say that not very many people would watch it and it's not going to make any money. It's like, do we still have those categories? And if so, is there a good argument to be made for the government should allocate a certain amount of funding to kind of help get them off the ground, to help build Rome, so to speak?
I understand what you do mean, but it all comes down. There's lots of sports out there that don't get much viewing, but it still happens. And do trans athletes want the same recognition as your normal man and woman, or are they happy to be in this growth period? Do you know what I mean by that? Like, if they're happy to be in the growth period and happy to learn and happy to grow,
or to contribute to the movement growing over time.
Right. If they are, then do it. But if they're not, and it's not going to make money, then I can't see it happening at all. I can't see it. I believe it should be. Why not? But I can't see it happening because of the money aspect. If it doesn't make money, it doesn't make sense.
And my sense is that if it doesn't make money, and there are those two categories, it's then a conversation to be had with the public in like a town square type of format of, do we want to collectively invest taxpayer dollars in trying to foster this this new kind of category of sports? Probably, obviously not comparing Paralympics to trans competition in a derogatory sense,
I know
but
what you mean by, I know exactly what you're trying to say.
First couple of
inclusive. It's inclusive.
The first, right? So why did the Paralympics begin, or any kind of handicapped competition like that? We want to foster competition within a group that can't really compete fairly in the existing categories, right? So, and I imagine that the first round of competitions, say for example the Paralympics, wouldn't have drawn a very large audience.
No, not at all.
But over time, Rome wasn't built in a day, right? It's grown. And so I guess the argument is perhaps the same thing could happen for trans sports over time. And maybe, if the conversation is had, there's a certain degree of government funding that might help kickstart that, potentially.
Yeah, but which government's going to take the first step?
Right.
Is it going to be Australia? Is it going to be America? Is it going to be the UK? I can't see it be in China or any
Yeah,
communist
no.
countries.
It'll definitely be
Yeah.
somewhere in the West. Where,
Exactly right. But it all comes. Who wants to take the risk?
Yep.
Because it will be a lot of money. It will be millions and millions and millions
Yeah.
of dollars.
That could go to other things, right? I mean, this is another conversation, but let's say it's going to say the trans inclusion activists said we want $20 million of grants to foster in this direction or for this project. $20 million, where else can that be spent?
A lot of small businesses.
Small businesses, homeless people,
Yeah.
right? Violence against women.
Yeah.
There's plenty of things that we can spend money on. We need to make a decision, again, collectively about where are we going to invest that money. Dude, I think we explored the topic really well there. Yeah,
Beautiful.
dude.
Thank you.
I appreciate your time,
No
Trent.
worries, bro.
All right, Jesse, let's rock and roll, man. So I'm not sure how much Liam has told you about what the goal here is, but in a nutshell, we want to ask the important but controversial questions with the goal of finding common ground.
Yeah.
So it's not me versus you, you versus me, or anything like that. I want to understand what your position is and why you're there, and hopefully you want to do the same for me, and then see if we can kind of weave our way into the middle somewhere.
Yeah.
So trans athletes, should they have their own competitive category or not?
I don't think. Well, my thought on it has always been both a yes and a no.
Okay.
Because the crux of the issue is that people are not happy about the fact that trans athletes have testosterone in their body, and that kind of gives them an advantage over women who don't have that, or haven't been through that.
Yep.
My personal opinion is that it should be split into people who have had testosterone in their body, people who haven't.
Right.
So it would be women on one side, and then men, and trans women.
Interesting. Okay, so just make sure I understand. Maybe in like the same way that we have like weight categories in boxing or something like that, we would have testosterone categories.
Yes.
Okay. What about? So testosterone it's both like the technical terms. It's an activational hormone, which is to say that it kind of acts right now and has an impact. But it's also an organizational hormone, which is to say that when I'm growing up as a biological male, it influences certain developmental processes that have long-lasting effects, right? So whether it's the frame of my hips, preparing for childbearing or not, amongst other things as well. But in that sense, we might have how would you account for that? Say, for example, you have a category for testosterone levels between 5 and 10 nanomole per liter, which is more towards the biological male side typically. But say, for example, a trans woman, if she were kind of made to compete in that category, she might have the same testosterone as myself, but she wouldn't have accrued the benefits of a biologically male puberty. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Do you have any idea about how you might kind of make it fair for her?
I feel like that is something that you need a lot of people to talk about and get common ground about.
Yeah, totally. And I don't know the answer to that either.
It's stuff like that where you need professors and scientists figure out from an objective level, and also a subjective level from people currently in the community.
Yep. One idea for you. Let's say that, for example, we had that same situation. Would it be fair to have a category of, so let's say there's a testosterone category of between 5 and 10 nanomole per liter, and there's also a subcategory within that, or we're getting a bit complex here, but subcategory within that of testosterone between 5 and 10 nanomole per liter, plus you went through a male puberty, and then maybe another category of 5 to 10 nanomole per liter didn't go through male puberty. Would that be fairer in your eyes?
I'm not sure, because the main reason why trans athletes don't really like the idea of having a trans category is because they feel segregated from everyone else.
Yep.
I think having more categories might induce that kind of feelings.
Right.
I'm not sure.
In a, and that's so. you mentioned what I loved at the very beginning when you sat down. You tried to put your finger on what the crux of the issue is, like what's at the core of it. As far as I can tell, it's a balancing of two variables.
Yeah.
One is trans inclusion. Overwhelmingly, the people I speak to are pro-trans inclusion. They want trans people to be included somehow. But it's being balanced with the second variable, which is how do we ensure fairness of competition and safety for biological females.
Yeah.
And my concern is that, something that I'm noticing is that if some people speak out and say trans women can't compete in the women's category or trans men can't compete in the men's category, that people are very quickly labelled transphobic or trans exclusionary when they may in fact be very pro-trans inclusion. It's just that they're not sure exactly how to implement it. So you kind of get stuck between balancing biological female rights with trans women's rights. And I guess, as we can see, it gets very complex very quickly.
Yeah.
But yeah, is there anything that you think, let's say, for example, you think that trans women ought to be able to compete with biological women in the women's category, and trans men ought to be able to compete against biological males in the men's category. Is there anything that you think people who tend to thoroughly disagree with you on, say, the other side of the argument, something that they miss?
I'm not sure. I think whenever I have these kinds of discussions with my friends, I think one of the bigger points is it's not necessarily an issue. Try to figure out how to word this.
Take your time.
One of the bigger points is, say, for example, trans women in participating with biological women.
Yep.
Even though trans women went through the hormones, the testosterone, to transition to who they want to be.
Yep.
Even though they didn't do that to get a competitive advantage, it still imposes that kind of pressure on the biological women to do the same. Like how when you do doping in Olympics or whatever.
Yeah.
People at the top who do doping are kind of put pressure on everyone on the bottom.
Yep, absolutely. That's such a good point, because I think that's often very easily overlooked. In the media, for example, we hear a lot about, or much more so, about trans women dominating the women's category. We don't hear very often about trans men dominating the men's category. And we also don't hear a lot about trans men being included in the men's category. So one thing that I've been trying to put my finger on today with people like yourself is what you've just brought up, that if we expect trans women, so biological males who've then transitioned to some degree or another to being and identifying as a woman, and let's say they've undergone a degree of hormone therapy as well and maybe surgical procedures, if we expect trans women to compete against biological females in the women's category, then we're also implicitly expecting biological females who've transitioned to being a trans man to compete against biological males. And is that unfair for trans men? Do you see what I mean? It's like, okay, well, let's say, for example, in one of the sports where there's the greatest disparity between the high-end male performers and high-end female performers is something like powerlifting or Olympic lifting. And is it fair for trans men to be expected to compete against biological males who've accrued the benefits of a male puberty? And then also, is that setting up bad, I just want to throw in another seed here. Is that not dangerously incentivizing some quite extreme hormone therapies for trans athletes? Right? So, my concern would be, are we then going to be incentivizing trans men to take perhaps unhealthy amounts of testosterone to try and compete amongst the males?
Yeah.
And then vice versa as well. Are we going to be encouraging unhealthy amounts of testosterone suppression in trans women in order to be able to compete within that category fairly? It becomes a real pickle.
Yeah.
Anyway, I want to respect your time because you said you had to jet to get the train.
I've got some more time.
You're good? Awesome.
I was going to say, yeah. Well, imagine back before we had segregation between men and women's sports.
Yep.
It was not fair on the women because they had to compete with men. And I imagine the same kind of issues happening now as well with trans athletes. Maybe feeling like that they should belong with it, but other people don't.
Well, I'd say it's take that example that we just looked at, right?
Yeah.
The trans men, they might feel like it's unfair because how am I supposed to compete against the biological males?
It's an issue. I don't think there is one correct answer because it's always going to be, all right, how far do we split the categories down? Like you mentioned before, we were talking about splitting how many millimeters or
Categories with testosterone levels and whatnot. Yep. And that's I think a recurring problem is like, okay, if we split based on men's, women's, then if we split based on men's, women's, trans women's, then do we split again based on trans women, trans men, trans women with X number of testosterone, trans women with X number of testosterone, and it kind of becomes a keep going down the line. Are we then going to separate by height, by weight, whatever?
Yeah.
So one thing that you made me think of just before you said something that made me think of between different sports, there are different performance differences between biological males and biological females. So for example, if you have a look at something like powerlifting, the difference between high-end males and high-end females tends to be around 50% at the top. Something like swimming, it's much closer to a 10 to 20% difference. Let's say that we were going with the route of including trans athletes within the existing categories of men's and women's sports. Do you think that there ought to be then, given the disparities at the high end given the difference in performance disparities between different sports, do you think that we ought to have different intervention requirements in order to get, say, trans women competing in the men's category for powerlifting compared to swimming?
I'm not sure. I think this is more. I think it's the same kind of issue where you want to try to figure out how deep you want to split things up. Like for example, say you had a group of biological males. They might not have all going to have the same kind of testosterone or body development as each other.
Yep.
So of course they're going to have inherent limitations in how much they can do.
And differences between the different individuals, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if that would be the best way to go about it, because in those kinds of categories with just biological men and women, there already is that kind of disparity. I'd imagine not between genders, but also between that category itself.
Yep.
Again,
comes down to the categories and
I've got no numbers or anything, so I've got.
Dude, that's fine. You don't need numbers. I think it's great to do research and have those numbers and be familiar with the studies and whatnot. But a lot of it as well, I think it's we find our way through the darkness by having conversations like this, and you illuminating certain blind spots that I have, and me illuminating certain blind spots that you have. So one thing that I'll share with you that I was thinking about recently is I think it was November last year, the IOC, International Olympic Committee, released this set of guidelines, which we might be able to pop up on the screen when this goes live, or put a link in the description or something. But they essentially said, we want individual sporting bodies to set their own requirements for when trans women can compete in the women's category and when trans men can compete in the men's category. as opposed to before that, the IOC had a blanket rule that they said everyone has to follow this.
Yeah.
And it was something like trans men can compete in the men's category without issue, without requirement. And feel free to correct me on this. I might have missed the details, and trans women could compete in the women's category if they had testosterone levels below a certain amount for something like 12 months. So below a certain amount for a certain period of time. Then the IOC said, last year said, no, that doesn't make sense because the nature of the sports change. So swimming might have different requirements to soccer, to AFL, to powerlifting, etc. So there's this great website called transathlete.com. I think that's it. That lists out all of the different kind of requirements that different sporting bodies have for trans athletes competing in respective categories, right? And so there seems to be this general consensus that having, in particular trans women, having testosterone levels below 5 nanomole per litre for a minimum of 12 months and identifying as a woman, then you can compete in that category. But there are certain sporting bodies that don't go by that same kind of consensus. So for example, I think it's USA Powerlifting or Powerlifting USA, something like that, don't let trans women compete in the women's category. And that's because they state on their website it's because of the immutable advantages that are gained through having gone through male puberty. But then there are other bodies. I think one might have been like Badminton USA. I'll have to there's going to be a link in the description of this video with an essay that I've written that kind of explores all of this. But there are some sporting bodies that say, okay, 10 nanomole per litre is fine, not 5 nanomole per litre. So there are different criteria depending on the sporting body that are trying to establish an equal and fair playing field and safe. But obviously there's no consensus. There's no clear consensus, and that 5 nanomole per litre, I guess 5 nanomole per litre for 12 months is the general consensus at the moment. But there's a lack of strong data indicating that that is the magic number that equalizes the playing field. And so my position, or my sense of all this is very much how do we include trans individuals, but how do we also maximize and ensure the safety of biological females and also the competitive fairness, and that there ought to be, if trans athletes are to compete in the women's and men's categories, that there ought to be different interventions expected, sport by sport and even race by race. So for example, 100-meter sprint that requires much more power, or performance in that requires much more power compared to like a 10,000 meter run. My concern is that we just don't have the data on that at the moment. We don't know exactly what the advantage is that we need to compensate for in equalizing the playing field in the 100-meter sprint compared to the 5,000-meter race, compared to the marathon, compared to the powerlifting, compared to this, that, the other. So I thought I'd share that with you. And I wonder whether if we had more of these conversations exploring what can seemingly be quite a simple question, people would recognize that, when someone says yes or no, they're not automatically a bigot or not. They might actually have the same values, but their sense of how to implement those values within the society we live in is different.
Yeah.
So, which I think can be really humbling. Like, you and I might disagree from the beginning on yes or no to this question, but we actually have similar values, is my sense. So, yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to finish, Jesse.
Yep, no worries.
Hey, thanks for your time.
Mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, that is all that we have for you today. I hope you enjoyed those convos. Thanks for watching to the end. A special shout out to Rosemary, Trent and Jesse. Thanks for taking the time to sit down with us and explore your positions. With that said, it is now your turn. We want to hear from you. What do you think? Should trans athletes have their own competitive category or not? We want you to drop a yes or no in the comment section below. If you have the time, feel free to explain your position or highlight anything you think I might have missed in mine. In the future, we're also going to be dropping clips, sneak previews of the extended YouTube videos on Insta and TikTok. Links to those will be in the description if that's something that you're interested in. Beyond that, if you want to support what we're doing here at Common Ground Conversations, there are two things you can do. One, like the video, and two, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell icon to get pinged when we drop episode 2. Last but not least, if you're the particularly curious type, there's a link in the description to the essay I wrote exploring the question at hand in a little more depth, explaining my position, citing all of the sources and studies that went into it. So again, if that's something you're interested in, link will be in the description. Feel free to highlight anything you think I've missed. I really do welcome the feedback. The goal isn't to be right. The goal is to be wrong for the shortest amount of time possible. With all that said, it is adios for now. Take care of yourselves. Ciao. But wait, there is one more thing. We actually just dropped our own controversial conversation card deck. If you love these types of combos, the deep, intellectually stimulating, juicy questions, and you like unpacking them with friends and family, this is perfect for you. So here are a couple of clips of us playing the cards with strangers in Melbourne City over the past week.
Okay. What are the pros and cons of modern day feminism?
There we go. What is toxic masculinity and does toxic femininity exist?
What is a man, what is a woman, and how are they different?
Ooh, go for it. The moment of truth.
Should men and women have distinct roles in a relationship?
So these are deliberately controversial but important questions, right?
Okay.
The types of questions that we all think, but we're like, can't really say this at work or can't really ask it. And we just want to ask the questions, right? And have good faith, open conversations where I respect your opinion, you respect mine, and we kind of unpack everything that's going on and then we try and find common ground. So that said, gents, pick a card. So like I said, if you love those types of questions and these types of conversations, you can get a deck of these. There'll be a link in the description below. And with that said, I will see you in episode 2. Ciao.